The fog came in off the Atlantic that morning, the way it always did in late October, rolling over the spruce and settling into the low places between the hills, and nobody in Mahone Bay could have guessed that the man walking into the animal shelter that day had already been chosen. Twice. Before he'd even taken off his boots. Desmond Cray was 54 years old, and for most of those years he had been someone else. Not in the sense of a different name or a different face, but in the sense that the man who had once moved through compounds in Kandahar, with his hand resting on the shoulder of a Belgian Malinois named Axel, bore almost no resemblance to the man who now spent his mornings fixing outboard motors in a cold shed behind his house on the South Shore. He was tall still, and broad through the chest, though the years had softened the hard edges just enough that strangers no longer crossed the street when they saw him coming. His hair had gone the color of weathered cedar, more gray than brown now, and he kept it cut close out of habit rather than vanity. His hands, when they were still, had a way of curling slightly at the knuckle, an old injury from a fast rope exercise, 2 decades gone, that ached worse in the damp Nova Scotia winters than it ever had in the desert. He had come to Canada 18 years earlier for the plainest reason a man can have. He had fallen in love with a woman from Lunenburg County named Eleanor Whitcomb, a marine biologist who studied the scallop beds off the coast, and who had a laugh that made him feel, for the first time since his last deployment, like the war might actually be over. They married in a boathouse with paper lanterns and a fiddler who couldn't keep time, and Desmond had thought, foolishly and completely, that he had outrun whatever it was that followed men home from places like that. Then the cancer came, quiet and patient, the way it does, and it took Eleanor in 14 months. And Desmond found himself, at 52, a widower in a country that was not his own, in a house that still smelled faintly of her rosemary shampoo no matter how many times he washed the sheets. He had lost Axel 11 years before that, in a firefight outside a village whose name he had made himself forget. And he had promised himself then that he would never again let anything with a heartbeat matter to him that much. He had broken that promise once, for Eleanor. He had no intention of breaking it again, so he worked. He fixed engines for the fishermen who still went out of the harbor, and in the evenings he sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, watching the light change over the water, and he called this peace because the truer name for it frightened him more than any firefight ever had. His younger sister, Robin Cray, had moved to Mahone Bay 2 years after Eleanor's death, ostensibly to be closer to family. Though everyone in town understood, it was because she couldn't stand the thought of her brother alone on that hill, with nothing but a radio and a toolbox for company. Robin was 39, warm in the particular way that made old men flirt with her at the farmer's market. And stray cats follow her home, and she volunteered 2 mornings a week at the Lunenburg County Animal Rescue, mostly because she had never in her life met a broken thing she didn't want to fix. It was Robin who called him on a Tuesday in late October, her voice doing the thing it did when she wanted something and was trying to sound like she didn't. "The furnace at the shelter's acting up again," she said. "Nadia thinks it's the pilot light, but you know how she is with machinery. Could you come take a look? I'll buy you a coffee after. Double, the way you pretend you don't like it." Desmond had no particular objection to fixing a furnace, and even less objection to Robin's coffee bribery, so he drove the 20 minutes out to the shelter with his toolbox on the passenger seat and the radio tuned to nothing in particular, the fog still sitting low over the fields, like something that hadn't decided whether to lift. He had been to the shelter exactly once before, the week after Eleanor's funeral, when Robin had gently suggested that a dog might help with the quiet. And Desmond had walked the length of the kennels without stopping, without looking any animal in the eye, and had driven home and not spoken to his sister for 4 days. Robin had not brought it up since. She was smart enough not to mention it now either, only handing him a mug of shelter coffee that tasted like it had been made sometime during the previous administration, and pointing him toward the utility room. He was halfway across the main corridor, tools in hand, when something collided with his leg. It was not a dog so much as a rumor of one. 7 weeks old, all paws and ears. A German shepherd mixed the color of wet sand with a white blaze down her chest that looked like someone had spilled paint on her by accident. She had launched herself out of an open kennel gate before the volunteer cleaning it could stop her, crossed 12 feet of tile floor in roughly 1.5 seconds, and was now attempting, with the full and unreasonable confidence of a creature who had not yet learned the concept of a stranger, to climb Desmond's boot. "Bramble, no, sorry, she's fast, I swear I only turned my back for." A young volunteer, breathless, scooped for the puppy and missed. Desmond looked down. The puppy looked up. She sat, suddenly, and with great ceremony, directly on his foot, and gazed at him with the particular tragic devotion of a creature who has just decided, unilaterally and for reasons of her own, that this enormous, gray-haired stranger belongs to her now. "She does this," the volunteer said apologetically, finally catching up and lifting the puppy, who yodeled a small protest. "She's not choosy. She'll do it to anybody." But Desmond, looking past the volunteer and the wriggling puppy, had gone still in a different way, the old watchful stillness that Robin sometimes still caught in him, and that always made her chest tighten a little. At the far end of the corridor in the last kennel, another dog sat pressed into the back corner of the run, not moving, not making a sound. He was larger than the puppy, clearly a littermate, but built ranger, darker, with a patch of scar tissue across one shoulder where fur had never properly grown back, and a torn notch in his left ear that had healed wrong. His eyes were the flat amber of a dog who had learned, at some point far too young, that the world was not to be trusted, and they were fixed on Desmond with an intensity that had nothing needy in it at all. He did not come forward. He did not so much as shift his weight. He simply watched the way a sentry watches a tree line, and Desmond, who had spent 11 years of his life reading exactly that kind of stillness, in exactly that kind of creature, felt something in his own chest go very quiet. "That's Onyx," the volunteer said, following his gaze. "Bramble's brother. They came in together about 3 weeks ago. Someone found them out past Chester Basin, tied up behind a place that had been empty a while. Onyx won't let anybody near him except her." She nodded at the puppy still tucked against her hip. "We've had 4 different families come look at them. Nobody wants to take on a dog like that. Can't blame them, honestly." Desmond said nothing. He set down his toolbox, which he did not remember deciding to do, and walked the length of the corridor, slow, unhurried, the way he used to walk into rooms where something dangerous might be waiting. Though there was no danger here, only a scarred animal deciding in real time whether the man approaching was one more thing to survive. He crouched 3 feet from the kennel gate, well outside the reach of teeth, and did not look directly at the dog's eyes, because some part of him that had never stopped. Being a soldier still remembered that direct eye contact was a threat, not a greeting. He looked instead at the middle distance, at the dog's chest, and let the silence sometimes does better than words. Onyx did not come to him. Onyx did not so much as blink, but he did not retreat further into the corner either, and in a dog who had apparently pressed himself into that corner for 3 straight weeks, that was not nothing. "He's never done that," the volunteer said quietly. "Held still like that, with someone new." Desmond stood up, feeling the old ache in his knee, and told himself, quite firmly, that this meant nothing at all. He fixed the furnace. He drank the terrible coffee. He said goodbye to Robin in the parking lot, and did not look back at the building, though he was aware. In the particular way, a person is aware of a splinter they have decided not to deal with, that both animals had watched him leave. One straining against the volunteer's arms to follow, the other simply watching, unmoving, from the shadow of his kennel. He told himself he would not go back. He went back 4 days later, telling himself it was to check the furnace held, which was a lie he did not even bother making convincing. Bramble greeted him like a returning war hero, shrieking with joy and running in 3 complete circles before flinging herself at his shins. Onyx did not run. Onyx rose slowly from the back of his kennel for the first time in front of a visitor other than the volunteer who fed him, and walked, stiff, deliberate, every muscle telegraphing how much this cost him, to the front of the gate, where he sat, exactly as far from Desmond's hand as he judged safe, and simply existed in his presence. Nadia Kesting, who ran the shelter and had seen every version of human hesitation there was to see, leaned in the doorway with her arms crossed, and a look on her face that Desmond recognized as the particular patience of someone who already knows how this ends and is waiting for the other person to catch up. "You know," she said, "we don't usually place them separately. Bramble won't settle without her brother nearby. We tried once, for a foster, and she cried for 6 hours straight, and Onyx won't let anyone close at all unless Bramble's there first, softening the ground for him." She paused. "Which means whoever takes one has to take both. Most people hear that and walk right back out." "I'm not most people," Desmond said, which was true in ways he did not intend and did not particularly want to examine. "No," Nadia agreed, watching him watch the dogs. "You're not." He drove home that evening with no dogs in the truck and an unbearable quiet in the cab that had never bothered him before, and he sat on the back porch with his cold coffee and looked at the dark water and thought. For the first time in 2 years, not about Eleanor's absence but about the specific weight of a dog's head on a boot, which was a memory that belonged to Axel and had no business surfacing now, uninvited, on a Tuesday in October. Robin, when he called her that night, ostensibly about nothing, which she saw through immediately, said only, "You already know what you're going to do. You're just walking around the edge of it first. You always do that. Did it for 6 months before you proposed to Eleanor, too." "That's different." "Sure it is," Robin said, in the voice of a woman who intended to be insufferably right about this for the rest of the winter. He went back on the Saturday, and this time he brought a lead and a soft-sided crate, and he did not tell himself any lies about why. The first month was harder than he let Robin know. Bramble was chaos given 4 legs. She ate a hydrobill off the counter, fell into the harbor off the dock, and had to be fished out by a passing lobsterman, who found the whole affair enormously entertaining, and once got so thoroughly skunked in the side yard that Desmond had to bathe her in tomato juice at 11 at night. While she looked up at him, with an expression of such profound betrayal, that he laughed for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit. She had, as Nadia put it, the emotional range of a golden retriever trapped in a shepherd's body, and she followed Desmond from room to room with the singular devotion of an animal who had decided, permanently and without appeal, that he was the finest thing to ever happen to her. Onyx was another matter entirely. He would not eat unless Bramble ate first. He would not enter a room Desmond was in unless the door stayed open behind him, an exit always visible. He flinched at raised voices, at sudden movement, at the crack of the wood stove settling at night, and twice in the first 2 weeks Desmond woke at 3 in the morning to find the dog standing rigid in the hallway, staring at nothing, in a state Desmond recognized with an ache he hadn't expected, because he had stood in that exact hallway himself, more nights than he could count, staring at his own version of nothing. "You and him are the same animal." Robin told him one evening, watching from the kitchen window as Desmond sat on the porch steps in the cold, 3 feet from where Onyx lay pressed to the boards, neither of them touching, both of them simply enduring the dark together. "You know that, right?" He did know it. He didn't say so. It was Gerald Fitch who filled in the rest of the story in November when Desmond drove out to the Veterans Outreach Center in Bridgewater to pick up a set of paperwork for a disability review he'd been putting off for 3 years. Gerald ran the center, a barrel-built former Army medic in his 70s with a laugh like a foghorn and a memory for names that put Desmond's to shame. And when Desmond mentioned, almost in passing, where the dogs had come from, Gerald's face changed. "Chester Basin," Gerald said slowly. "The old Prescott place?" That's what Nadia said. Gerald was quiet a moment, turning a pen over in his hands. "Walter Prescott, Army not Navy, served 2 tours, long before your time. Came home and never really came all the way back, if you understand me. Lived alone out there 30 years. Wouldn't take help from anybody, wouldn't come to the center no matter how many times I drove out and knocked. Had 2 dogs, a breeding pair he'd had since they were pups. Kept them close, wouldn't let the vet near them either, near as I could tell. He died back in September. Heart, they think. Nobody found him for the better part of 2 weeks." Gerald set the pen down. Nobody thought to ask where his dogs went. Desmond sat with that, for a long moment the paperwork forgotten on his knee. He thought of Onyx pressed into the back of his kennel watching. He thought of a man 30 years further down. A road Desmond himself had only started walking. a man who had loved something enough to keep it close and had still, in the end, been alone when it mattered most, and who had left behind an animal that had learned, from him, from that isolation, from whatever had happened in those 2 weeks before anyone came, that the world was not safe and that people could simply stop, without warning, and leave you waiting. He needed help he wouldn't take, Desmond said quietly. Most of you don't, Gerald said, not unkindly, until something makes you. The snowstorm came in the second week of December, early and hard, the kind the South Shore got maybe once every few winters, the kind that dropped the power out across 3 counties and left Desmond's road impassable by dusk. He'd been out at the shed when it hit, and by the time he made it back to the house, the wind had picked up to a scream and the snow was coming sideways. And he found Bramble in a state of gleeful confusion by the door. Snow was, to her mind, an excellent development, and Onyx nowhere in sight. He found him 20 minutes later, after a search that put a genuine cold fear into Desmond's chest for the first time in years, huddled in the lee of the woodshed, shaking, the storm having triggered something in him that no amount of gentle handling had touched. Desmond crouched down in the driving snow, no lead, no crate, nothing between them but 11 feet of frozen ground, and for the first time since the day they'd met, he spoke. "I know," he said, quiet, level, the words nearly lost in the wind. "I know what this is. I've stood right where you're standing. Storm doesn't care what it takes from you, but you don't have to ride it out alone this time. That's the only thing that's different now." He did not reach for the dog. He simply sat down, in the snow, in the full fury of the storm, and waited, the cold seeping through his jeans, his hands going numb, Bramble whining anxiously from the porch behind him. It took 11 minutes. Desmond counted them, the way he'd once counted minutes in far worse places. And then Onyx moved, not toward Desmond's hand, not yet, but close enough that his shoulder came to rest against Desmond's arm, the two of them sitting together in the howling dark, and Desmond understood, with a clarity that arrived like something long overdue, that this was not a dog choosing the wrong man after all. This was a dog and a man who had both been standing in their own separate storms for years, each certain no one else could possibly understand the specific shape of it, finding out, at last, that they had been wrong. They stayed out there together until the worst of the wind passed, and when Desmond finally rose, stiff and half-frozen, Onyx rose with him and walked at his side back to the house without being asked. And that night, for the first time, he lay down in the front room rather than the hallway, close enough that Desmond could hear him breathing. Spring came late to the South Shore, the way it always did, but when it came the hillside above Desmond's house went green and then gold with the wild mustard that grew along the fence line. And Robin drove out most Sunday mornings now, not out of worry anymore but out of habit, because there was coffee, and there were 2 dogs who greeted her arrival like a parade, and because her brother, she had noticed, had started fixing up the old boathouse behind the house, clearing it out, patching the roof, for reasons he hadn't fully explained even to himself yet, though Gerald Fitch had mentioned, more than once, that the outreach center could always use a quiet space closer to the water. Somewhere a man and his dogs might sit with somebody else, who was still learning how to come in out of their own storm. Bramble by then had graduated from chaos to something closer to joy with better aim, though the joy had never once dimmed. Onyx still watched doorways. He still flinched at sudden sounds, but he slept most nights now with his head against Desmond's boot, in the exact spot where Bramble had first claimed him on a foggy Tuesday in October. And some evenings, when the light came long and gold across the water, Desmond would sit on the porch steps with a dog on either side of him and think that he had come to that shelter, believing he had nothing left in him to give, and had left it, in the end, having been given back more than he ever thought the world still owed him. He had been the wrong man for exactly no one. He had simply been waiting, same as they had, for someone to sit down in the storm and stay.